For the latest news and updates on Tibet, subscribe to Yarloon YouTube channel. And don't forget to click the notification bell icon.
Thank you very much for that wonderful, very erudite and impassioned explanation of the thing. There was one point which I think I need to remind you. The first diplomatic mission to Tibet was led by a Scotsman. And next year is the 250th anniversary.
Oh.
George Bogle.
Oh, Bogle,
who was a graduate. No, he wasn't. Yes, he was a graduate at this university.
Bogle was there in Tibet in mid-19th century, yes. And he may also have a Tibetan child.
1774. He spent 6 months with the Panchen Lama.
Yes.
Yes. It was a wonderful camaraderie.
18th century.
Yes, 18th century.
Yes. Thank you. I'll read more.
On a more serious point, you talked of leverage. Can you explain why it was so important to re-establish the all-parliamentary group in the Indian Parliament? Is there an idea of being able to extract leverage from India?
Everywhere we try to form parliamentary groups for Tibet, and we always make it all-party. Whether it's here in Holyrood, you have all-party members support, or the cross-party support group for Tibet. In London also we have all-party parliamentary group for Tibet. In India also we have all-party parliamentary forum for Tibet. In the United States there is not such a forum, but Tibet is only one issue where Democrats and Republicans can come together. And we have been emphasizing on the need for all political parties to come together on the issue of Tibet. And by the time when I joined the Tibetan Parliamentary and Policy Research Center as a director in 2001, the parliamentary group for Tibet has diminished in its formation, functions, and things like that. So we wanted to rejuvenate that. And when I reached Delhi, we reformed the group. Because earlier, when we came into exile, there were a lot of supporters, very senior Indian politicians, and all that. And eventually it deteriorated a little bit. Then we decided to reform that. And those are very important groups for us to reach out to the government. Yes.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Aaron Moore. I'm the Honda Chair of Japanese-Chinese Relations, and with the support of the ASI, have helped to co-organize this event. Thank you very much for the presentation today. I just had a quick question. When I was a PhD student living in China at the time, I spent a few months living in Xinjiang in the west, in Kashgar, which is one of the main centers of the Uyghur population. And this would have been about a year after the 9/11 attacks on the United States. And I was always struck at how welcoming and open the Uyghurs were to strangers who were coming into their land. But one thing that I noticed very quickly, and I revisited Xinjiang again about 10 years later, from 2002 and then again in 2012, was how much Kashgar had changed in the meantime. And a lot of it had to do with infrastructure investments made by the Chinese government, building a railway, building new housing, establishing new schools. And the city of Kashgar, which I was very fond of, was disappearing quite quickly at that time. And you were seeing rapid population growth across western Xinjiang from Khotan up to Kashgar for people working in the oil industry and other sorts of companies coming from other provinces of China. So I'm wondering, these sorts of investments that are happening in Tibet as well, if it's having an impact on the preservation of culture, assets, cultural assets, historic buildings, and these sorts of things across the Tibetan region. If you've seen this amongst the population both inside Tibet now and outside of Tibet, if they feel that they're losing a certain element of their heritage while these investments are going on.
Much of Tibet was destroyed in the first 15, 20 years of Chinese invasion, and particularly during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76. We estimate that about 6,000 Tibetan monasteries were destroyed. More than 1.2 million Tibetans were impacted directly or indirectly as a consequence of Chinese occupation. 1.2 million Tibetans died or killed. as a consequence of Chinese occupation. So a lot of things were destroyed. Anything during the 10 years of cultural, everything old was destroyed, not only in Tibet, but in the whole of China, but more so in Tibet. And then our representative was also counting numbers as to how many Tibetans were disrobed and how many Tibetans were killed during those periods. But then later, when Mao Zedong died in 76 and Deng Xiaoping came into power, he was a little more liberal. And in the early 80s, we had some freedom because the Chinese premier Hu Yaobang was also quite open to send a delegation into Tibet to study the situation, and he found that it was worse than 1949. So he sent back many of the cadres, about 85% of the Chinese cadres from Tibet back to China. Then again, by late 80s, the corresponding events are His Holiness' five-point peace proposal in 87, and then expanding on the fifth point, His Holiness spoke at the Strasbourg European Parliament called the Strasbourg Proposal of 1988, expanding on the fifth point of negotiation. And then Hu Jintao was in Tibet as party secretary, and then there were demonstrations in 87, 88, and then he imposed martial law in Tibet, and then it started tightening up again. Then when Jiang Zemin came into power, then became more and more control. And during when Hu Jintao became the president, then everything became more tight. Now during Xi Jinping's time, Xi Jinping's idea is one nation, one culture, one language, one religion. I say religion because some people question that because they paint every religion with a red brush, communist brush. So Buddhism with Chinese characteristics, Christianity with Chinese, everything to do with Chinese characteristics. So that with that, it has definitely impacted a lot. But some of the old structures, the monasteries were rebuilt, but that's just a facade because the number of monks and nuns have come down drastically. And these institutes of learning are no more as it used to be in independent Tibet. And today, Chinese government, apart from the declining number of monks and nuns, they have taken over the management of the monasteries, which earlier used to be the domain of the monastic order. Now you have the security agencies of multiple security agencies of the Chinese government in the management of the monastic institutions. The Chinese government also wants to be responsible for setting the curriculum for the Buddhist institutions, the atheist government. And the monks and nuns movements are strictly curtailed. You need at least 4 or 5 different permits to travel from place to place, which earlier used to be completely free. It's necessary for masters to travel different parts and preach and all that. And they also changed the rule of the religious areas, use of religious areas of 2005. Just a few months ago, they changed that. There was also a new internet and security law. All these laws are not very well defined, so they can use it for anything. Any level of administration can use it for anything to arrest people in the name of national security and social stability. In these two names, they can do anything. So the lifestyles, the way of life is also changing because now China is redesigning every aspect of Tibetan life, whether it's social or religious or cultural, through state-sponsored, state-engineered policies and programs, including the monastic institutions, the colonial-style boarding schools that they have set up according to the numbers that we have from Tibet Action Institute. Children between the age of 6 to 18, about 1 million Tibetan children are now in boarding schools, colonial-style boarding schools, where they are taught in Mandarin. They are taught how to pay allegiance to the Chinese government. And now it's quite ironical that Chinese leaders portrays are in the monasteries. See, even atheist leaders looks like they want to be worshipped. So now they are more bothered about the yet to come 15th Dalai Lama than the living 14th Dalai Lama. So they passed this order number 5, which deals with recognition of reincarnated lamas, as we say, but they call it living Buddhas. So this is particularly aimed at the recognition of the 15th Dalai Lama, because they feel that if they can control the 15th Dalai Lama, they can control Tibet. But I keep asking them the question, have you not learned enough lesson from the Panchen Lama saga? Because the 10th Panchen Lama died under very mysterious circumstances. We believe that he may have been murdered at that time, but there was no post-mortem. So we can't prove anything, but there were signs that he must have been poisoned. He died in 89, and his reincarnation was found in 1995. There were communication between Communist China and the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama about the selection of that. And His Holiness declared his choice of the Panchen Lama, and the Chinese got furious. So they took that boy, six-year-old boy, with his family. We still don't know whether the real Panchen Lama is alive or not. There have been a lot of queries from international organizations, including the United Nations, but no answers from the Chinese government so far. They all keep saying, oh, he doesn't want to be disturbed, he's doing well, living with his family. That's all we get to hear about the Panchen Lama. And they selected Panchen Lama, who is not recognized by the Tibetans, not respected by the Tibetans. He doesn't live in his traditional seat in Tashilhumbu inside Tibet, but he lives in Beijing, where his status also has been degraded from the 10th Panchen Lama. If you look at the area where he's staying, the housing where he is, the kind of respect being given by the Chinese government. So he's also being used as a tool. That boy is also a Tibetan. So I keep asking the Chinese government, have you not learned enough lesson from the Panchen Lama saga? Whenever the time comes to look for 15th Dalai Lama, then if Chinese government select one, and we select one, Tibetans select one, then I ask the Chinese government, do you want a lifelong headache or not? Because this is not going to be one incident where you can resolve it or suppress it or repress it and resolve it. This is going to last a lifetime. So would they want a headache like that? There's something, but as referring to Kashgar, everything is changing. In Lhasa also things are changing. There were a lot of efforts by Chinese government to upgrade the townships into metropolitan cities, creating sister cities with Chinese cities, and then Western Development Plan and all that. And the Chinese government also, when I hear about conversations in the upper echelons of the Chinese leadership, they always complain, we invested so much money in Tibet. Why are the Tibetans complaining now? And I've heard Chinese leaders say many times, for every single problem, they feel that development is solution. They fail to understand the aspiration of the people. For the Tibetan people, we are devout Buddhists for 1,300 years. So Buddhism is religion, spirituality is more important for us than material development. Development of mind is more important than material development. That they fail to understand. And they don't take into account how much they have taken away from Tibet. You talked about all this infrastructure development in Kashgar, in Uyghur, in East Turkestan, but in Tibet also there are a lot of developments, roads, railways. Now they linked the mainland China from Kormo to Lhasa to Shigatse. Now they want to link it to Kathmandu. They've already linked it to Eastern Tibet in Nyingtri. They will link that again with Chindu in Chengdu. So that will become another lifelong. There are plans to connect railway from Nyingchi to Lantu in northern Tibet, northeastern Tibet. So all these rail infrastructure, and then a lot of roads are also being built, including the Pakistan-China corridor that comes from Uyghur into Tibet and into Pakistan. Now there are a lot more plans to build airstrips. So all these are not meant for Tibet's development or for the Tibetan people. All these are meant to promote China's Yi Ta Yi Lu, One Belt, One Road initiative through Tibet, because Tibet also was an extension of the Silk Road at that time. And it's all for the benefit of the Chinese government. When China has become the factory of the world, they need all the resources to feed these factories, raw materials. When they can go as far as Africa and Latin America, then why not Tibet? Because Tibet was a virgin land, completely unexploited. It was never excavated. Tibetans didn't believe in that. We were not developed enough also to do that. So China is taking away everything, but they don't count that. They only count what they think they are doing to Tibetans. And they fail to understand the real aspiration of the people, whether it's Tibetans or Uyghurs or the Mongols.
Thank you very much. I'll now open up to questions from the audience. If I could just remind you to keep your questions short, 1.5 to 2 minutes, so that everyone has an opportunity to ask a question within the limited time that we have left. And what I'll try to do after you've asked your question is repeat it to make sure that I've understood it correctly and that it can be recorded. So the question, if I understood you correctly, is the relationship that Tibet should have with Mongolia.
The Tibetan Buddhism spread to many areas. Now, Tibetan Buddhism is practiced in Kalmykia, Buryat, and Tuva in the Russian republics. Mongolia wholly, both inside and Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia. Now, Outer Mongolia is independent. Just recently, you heard about His Holiness recognizing the Khalkha Jesuit Thamba, who is the highest Geluk Buddhist leader in Mongolia, considered equivalent to Dalai Lama in Tibet. For the Mongolians is the Khalkha Jesuit Thamba, recognized by His Holiness last year. But this year, again, he was in Dharamsala. Only then people came to know about it. Chinese government was furious that they were not able to exercise their reincarnation theory on the Mongolians. For Mongols also, it's very difficult to work very closely with us because they are sandwiched between Russia and China, and they have no access of border with any other country other than these two. So they also have to be very careful. Earlier they were very poor. Now they have coal, oil, gas, and all that. So their situation is improving, but they don't have the machinery to. They have to send all the crude to the China, and then buy back the final product. So they're now engaging with Germans and other countries to invest in refining the natural resources that they have there, including, I think His Holiness' last visit was sometime in 2016, if I'm not wrong. But even that is a huge drama. His Holiness had to come all the way from Japan, and the Chinese government was pressuring the Mongolian government, and Mongolian government said, we don't know anything about His Holiness coming here. And if he's a Nobel laureate and a leader, international Buddhist leader, so they expressed their ignorance, but then of course we are very much in touch with it. When His Holiness came, they took His Holiness directly to the presidential office. And when the Chinese complained, then they said he's a Nobel laureate, so we were responsible for his security. And then Chinese said, if you allow the Dalai Lama to give a teaching, he cannot give the teaching in the stadium that was built by the Chinese for Mongolia. So Mongolia said, you can take back every brick of that stadium if you don't allow us. And His Holiness gave the same teaching in the stadium built by the Chinese. So there are a lot of tension when it comes to Tibetans, when it comes to Mongol-China relation and our relation with Mongolia, and they are also have to be apprehensive about China's reaction all the time. And it is difficult, but the Buddhist relation, we have monks, lamas going to Mongolia to preach there because Mongolians always look up to Tibet as a source of their spirituality. So that remains very strong. even today. But political, economic engagement is not much anyway, but political relations is still difficult. So we try to keep it that way, sometimes under the radar. Yes.
Further questions?
That also became a controversy when His Holiness said the women should be beautiful. So, to Tangbut Kharsa, it's martyrs. Now, since we lost independence, since we came into exile in 1959, some of the major incidents happened in 87, 88, and then again in 2008. 2008, there was widespread demonstrations all over Tibet, participated by people from all walks of life. And that was one of the biggest peaceful demonstrations inside Tibet. And since then, Chinese government clamped down on the Tibetans. And since Chinese government started clamping down from 2009 onwards, the first Tibetans self-immolated. Now, till last year, 157 Tibetans have self-immolated, hoping against hope that the Chinese government will pay some attention to their plight, or the international community will come to their rescue, but to no avail. But I keep reassuring the Tibetans that their sacrifices will not go in vain. So the rate of self-immolation has come down. We also appeal to the Tibetans inside Tibet not to self-immolate because their life is valuable. Our population is small. If you live longer, you can serve the cause for a longer period. If you burn yourself and die, then you serve only one time. So martyrdom is still going on, but we don't encourage it. It's a very thin line between violence and non-violence when it comes to self-immolation. It's not like Tibetans are not capable of killing Chinese, but they don't kill Chinese. They burn themselves to death to express their anguish. There was a time in 1963 when one monk burned himself in Vietnam and it became an international news. In Czech Republic in 1968, one person burned. So it also became an international news. After 157 self-immolations, still there is no response from the Chinese side or from the international community, and sometimes Tibet is not even mentioned. Just yesterday I was telling the British government, please mention Tibet at least in the statements that Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister makes or the government makes. At least that ensures that Tibet is considered as an unresolved country. If you don't mention Tibet, then people believe that it is not there. So we get often asked about why we don't hear about Tibet much more than we used to hear about Tibet earlier. So right now there is no political space whatsoever. So it's more like George Orwell's 1984 coming true in China, and more so in Tibet, where the state surveils everything. So China is the only country that spends more money on internal security than external security. That itself manifests a deep distrust between the rulers and the ruled. China uses all kind of artificial intelligence, whether it's electronic identification or geolocation, to track you. So if you are coming from outside Lhasa, and we are friends, and if I live in Lhasa, either you live with me or you live in a hotel. If you live in a hotel, then they know where you are, what you're doing. If you live with me, then if you take up any political action, then I'll suffer. Just like I was talking about self-immolations. If I have to think about burning myself, I have to think 100 times before doing that, because my immediate family is going to suffer because of my action. So that is how gridlocked it is. That is how you don't see much of the actions. People are afraid not only for themselves, they don't mind sacrificing themselves, but everybody around them suffers. So now they have started, since 2010, 2013, they have started DNA profiling of all the Tibetans. More than 1 million have been profiled already. We already know that the Chinese scientists have managed to change people's DNA. So we don't know what that will be used for. Of course, they always say it's for the national security and social stability. And maybe in future, if they change DNA of every Tibetan, then maybe they can say that they were never ever a Tibetan race. That's also possible. Now what they're doing is iris scanning of people without consent. So all kinds of artificial intelligence are being used to control. And the administrative structures are designed in such a way, quite similar to the SS of East Germany, where everybody is spying on everybody, so you can't trust anybody. So all those are very much in place. That is why we don't hear much about Tibet. And Tibet is locked out. Nobody can come out. All the passports are taken away by the government. About 3 weeks ago, or about a month ago, I hear rumors that Chinese government might give back the passports. They have started inviting people to apply for visa. And I know of a fact that some Tibetans have traveled from Nepal to outside Tibet Autonomous Region in Chengdu. People from Chengdu has also come to Nepal. So it's just opening up. We don't know where it's going to go. We're still watching the situation. So that is still people, and you cannot go in. That's why I think Chris Law is also discussing about reciprocity law in similar lines with the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act in the United States, where a Chinese person has a visa to go to the United States, he or she can go to any parts of the United States. Whereas a US citizen has a visa to go to China, but they need another permit to go into Tibet. So it's like going into a third country. So what that act says is if Chinese citizens have access to all areas of the United States, then United States citizens should also have access to all areas of China, including Tibet. That on similar lines, I think Chris Law and other parliamentarians are thinking about resolution to that effect. So that is one area. About, yeah. No, those, when His Holiness is asked whether reincarnation could be a woman, then he obviously says yes. Now, whether that will be a woman or a boy will be, of course, decided later when the time comes. But for His Holiness to return, Chinese government is keen that His Holiness returns and returns for good. So His Holiness has said several times in the last 2-3 years that if I get to go to China and Tibet, I'll go, but I'll not live there because there's no freedom there. So if His Holiness gets to go to China and Tibet, he will go, but he will return back to India because he feels that India is safer. Westerner friends can come to India to meet him. If things changes inside China and Tibet, they can also come and meet with His Holiness. That is there. Now with regards, I'm sure that so many questions might be happening, and some people are afraid to ask about that also, about His Holiness reincarnation process. So even the Central Tibetan administration will not be involved in the actual process of selection of the reincarnation, because this is completely Buddhist, spiritual, ritualistic process. So I'm not a religious leader. So even the Central Tibetan, forget about China or any other government to interfere in that. That is why we are asking governments also to pass a resolution on freedom of religion for His Holiness to be able to decide his own reincarnation. Because it's His Holiness who's going to be reborn. So when I was in America, one of our top leaders asked me, "You don't seem to have a process in place." I said, "That's your perspective." But then we have friends who understand China, and we have also watched China for many years. And if His Holiness decides now as to what will happen, then China has all the resources, human and financial, to spread propaganda around the world. And China cannot handle unpredictability. So His Holiness talking about emanation, His Holiness talking about reincarnation, even reincarnation of a woman, in the form of a woman. So all these confuses the Chinese government, and it's good for us. So as per the official document that we have on His Holiness reincarnation of September 2011, that's the only official document. That document also says that when His Holiness reaches the age of 90, then there will be another document on His Holiness reincarnation. So as I said before also, His Holiness says, another 20 years I'll live. So we are not in a hurry, but at the same time, we are also ready for any kind of contingency, so to prepare ourselves with protocols and other things. So those things are being done. And when His Holiness reaches the age of 90, there will be some more clarification or maybe some more exposure of what His Holiness thinks. But till that time, we will also be doing our own thing. And we will appreciate any international support on this matter, where whether it's a Tibet support group or a parliament or any other group can pass resolution saying His Holiness and His Holiness alone should be responsible for his reincarnation. And some of his statements have been consistent, whether there should be a 15th Dalai Lama or not. He has said since 1969 that it will be decided by the Tibetan people. So now for us it's a problem whether we should have a formal referendum or not. If we do have a formal referendum, then we are receiving complaints from our other Buddhist friends like Kalmikians and Buriyats. They are saying, we are also followers, so can't we have a say in His Holiness reincarnation? So those are also there. That's why I think it's much more wiser if every single unit, whether it's a Tibetan association or a Tibetan settlement or Mongolians, because the Indian Buddhist Association has already passed a resolution to that effect that His Holiness alone will be responsible for his reincarnation. The Japanese Buddhist Association have passed one. The others are also passing such kind of resolutions. America is the only country that has a law on Tibet called the Tibet Policy Act of 2002. Now that was amended in 2020. Now it's called Tibet Support and Policy Act, that incorporated the element of reincarnation from the US side. So the US Congress has already passed a law on that, and if similar actions can be taken in other countries, there'll be more pressure on the Chinese government. And as I said in the beginning also, if Chinese government is really looking, we don't know what, if it is another 20 years down the line, even Xi Jinping may not be there. So when Chinese government insists too much on the reincarnation, then His Holiness always says in jest, if Chinese government is really serious about reincarnation, they should study Tibetan Buddhism first, because this is very unique to Tibetan Buddhism. There are many Buddhist countries, but they don't believe in reincarnation like we do. So His Holiness also says if Chinese government is really serious about reincarnation, they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation first, Deng Xiaoping's reincarnation second. Now that Jiang Zemin is also not there, maybe Jiang Zemin's reincarnation third, and then maybe the Dalai Lamas. So in a very jovial way, His Holiness always responds.
I think we have time for maybe one more quick question, if there's a quick one. Yes, in the back.
Now, the reason why I say that is because Chinese government does not share hydrological data with any of its downstream riparian states. So people have no idea about what is going on in there. Now, just a few months ago, I was in Arunachal Pradesh. I went to the extreme northeast of Arunachal Pradesh, where we have Tibetan community there. And the state government was kind enough to provide us with a helicopter, and we were going on the helicopter, and this Brahmaputra enters into India from that place called Tuting in Arunachal Pradesh. And I found the Brahmaputra all muddy from the helicopter. And the smaller tributaries are pristine, clear water. So this has been there not just for 1-2 months. This has been there since 2018, the muddy water coming from Tibet, which means to say that there's a lot of work going on that river. And according to reports, Chinese government is building a dam bigger, twice the size of Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest in the world, on that Penpa area where the Brahmaputra comes from western Tibet to eastern Tibet and then takes a U-turn to come into India. At that place is called the Great Bend. And at that Great Bend, they are building this huge dam which is going to inundate areas upstream, and then this Himalaya came into being because of the tectonic shift of the Gondwana and the Asian plate, and some scientists believe that Himalaya is still growing. So these are all seismic zones. Now, if something happens to the size of that kind of a dam in Tibet, then what is going to happen to people in Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, and Bangladesh? They are all going to be washed away. So it's going to have severe consequences. So when China does not share hydrological data with any of its neighboring countries are also not in a position to speak up to China, because all these Southeast Asian countries are dependent on China, Burma, supported by Communist Party. Otherwise, they won't survive. Thailand also has its problem with democracy. Laos, severely dependent on China. Cambodia, almost 40% under debt with China. So maybe China will take over the Sihanouk whale port, where they have already taken over Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. They have already taken over Gwadar port in Pakistan, which are very strategic locations for the maritime Silk Road of China. They've surrounded India with what they call as pearl of strings. And if India reaches out to Vietnam and Taiwan and Japan, then China makes a lot of noise. India is surrounding us. Now they feel the United States is surrounding them. So all those factors are there. Since they don't share the hydrological data with the neighboring countries can't make an estimate of the river flow that's coming from those regions. And there are also speculations that China might divert the Brahmaputra north instead of coming in south into India. So if these things happen, then there will be serious food security issues and water security issues. And some believe that Third World War can happen because of water. Whether that happens or not, it's a different question. But then all these downstream countries are already facing problems, but not able to speak up against the Chinese government. But they are very conscious about the forthcoming disasters. So these are the biggest footballs of Asia and the most densely populated. Some of the people who live on the riverside, their lifestyles are already changing. Livelihood methods are already changing. So this will have serious consequences. We really, if China has to be more cooperative and in sharing hydrological data, and also have water sharing agreements with the neighboring countries, which they don't have. So right now, any river that flows from Tibet, China has all the control, and they don't even discuss about water sharing. So I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for attending the lecture. I think what's become eminently clear, whether you are an American or British or Chinese, that Tibet is a country of great significance. And it's going to continue to be a country of, I suppose, even greater significance, whether it's from environmental issues or the issues that impact the relations between countries like the United States and China and India. And so we are very fortunate indeed to have a person of great significance here to speak on these issues. Thank you very much. Now, before we close, there are refreshments outside. Please go out and help yourself. But before you do, can we please thank our guest?
Thank you.